This is Dateline News and Conversations. My guest tonight, Mr. Ed Curtin. He's an author, he's a poet, he's an activist. He's been on the show before, and we've had some incredible, deep philosophical and political discussions. He's back tonight. He wrote a book. It's called Seeking Truth in a Country of Lies. It's a number of articles that he's written over the years that talk about a number of extremely important events and issues, and he's connected them with many things that happened in a historical context. Tonight, we're going to talk about the following article in the book. It's entitled David Talbot's Book, The Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of the American Secret Government. I bought that book several years ago, and I could not put it down. It was riveting. It was so disturbing to me in the details and the facts that Talbot related in this book. So tonight, I'm happy to welcome back Ed Curtin. Ed, welcome back.
Thank you, Regis. Glad to be here.
Well, you know, a number of people have appreciated the discussions we've had. It's a departure from most of what I do on this Dateline News and Conversation show, which is about current events, geopolitical events, Russia, the Ukraine war, etc. But what you've provided and what you're going to provide tonight in our discussion is some historical context, facts that have shaped who the United States is or what the United States is today, and it's not very pretty. So I want to begin, first of all, Ed, and I want you to talk about not just Alan Dulles, but John Foster, his brother. They played chess, and apparently they were both very competitive. And the title of the book is The Devil's Chessboard. I think Devil's Chessboard was some kind of a reference to the evil of these two men, the satanic nature of these two. And I want you to tell us about some of that tonight. So who is Alan Dulles and the legacy that he spawned?
Well, Alan Dulles is he is the former long-standing head of the Central Intelligence Agency, the director. He and his brother's roots to U.S. intelligence go back to the 19-teens, very far back in time. And his family connections to U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, the Soviet Union, and many, many other countries throughout the world, including Indonesia, oh my goodness, I'm having a bit of mind fog right here. Well, let's just leave it at this. To many countries throughout the world, of course, Nazi Germany and World War II, the Vietnam War, etc. But the family, goes back so long. Alan Dulles he graduated from Princeton University, I believe, in 1916, and he joined the State Department, where he became an intelligence agent. And the reason he got the job was because his uncle, and John Foster Dulles, his uncle as well, was Robert Lansing, who is the U.S. Secretary of State, who, by the way, and your listeners might check on this because I have not had time to do it yet. But his uncle, Robert Lansing, who was the Secretary of State from 1915 to 1920, my guess is, it's a guess, I don't know, is the great-grandfather, perhaps, of the CEO of National Public Radio today. His name is John Lansing. And John Lansing was, before he went to National Public Radio a few years ago, he was the head of all overseas propaganda broadcasting for the United States government. So these connections are not just, history as history. They extend down through the ages. But in any case, Allen Dulles was started in intelligence, and then he and his brother were part of Cromwell and Sullivan law firm, which started in about that time, 1920s, I believe it was, with long-standing connections to the Rockefeller family, to Standard Oil, to the companies, the corporations in Nazi Germany, Krupp Steel, and the corporation that made Zyklon gas for the gas chambers. And these guys had deep, deep connections all the way back. So we're talking over 100 years, the Dulles brothers. And then his brother, Allen Dulles, became the head of the CIA, and his brother, John Foster Dulles, was the Secretary of State under President Eisenhower. And John Foster Dulles died in 1959. But Allen Dulles, of course, went on to his infamous work with the Bay of Pigs and the Kennedy administration before President Kennedy fired him at the end of the year 1961. So that's a little background. I could tell you much, much more, and I would recommend a book. I'm going to hold up the book. It's called JFK versus Allen Dulles by Greg Poulgrain, who is an Australian researcher and writer. This is a fabulous book, which complements David Talbert's fascinating and fantastic book. So those two together will tell you so much about Allen Dulles that you probably won't sleep tonight.
All right. What I do know about Allen Dulles was he was involved in
Your microphone's off.
Yeah, I got it now. He was in the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. And he had been operating around the globe, but in Europe, and especially connections with his law firm and big banks in Wall Street and probably big banks in Europe, funding Nazi Germany in World War II.
Yes.
But what I think is important here is that he is the one who transformed the OSS and created the CIA, and he basically had a free hand, didn't he, under Eisenhower?
Yes, he had a completely free hand. And of course, the CIA was formed to front for the Wall Street banks and the law firms that fronted for the banks and did all the dirty work behind the scenes, such as Sullivan and Cromwell. And during the 1950s, of course, Dulles was intimately involved in perhaps the two most famous coup d'etats engineered by the CIA, one in Guatemala in, I think it was 54, and in 53 in Iran. And so, all of this, the history of the bloody Contra wars in Latin America of the 1980s and the Iran-Contra scandal, these have long histories in the U.S. coup d'etats against these countries back in the 1950s, which Allen Dulles, of course, was at the head of the list of people engineering these. It's really well, as David Talbot says, he was satanic. He was satanic, and during World War II, of course, yes, they funded the Nazi machine, but he also, when the war was over, Allen Dulles made sure, together with his co-worker at the time, James Jesus Angleton, who later became the head of CIA's counterintelligence, another evil, quote, genius, I say it in the sense of just destructive, but very tricky. So they brought all these ex-Nazis to the United States. They had what was called the rat lines, and they brought them into the U.S. government, to run the U.S. space program, to run the U.S. biological weapons program, and so on and so forth. And this was all aimed at that point after World War II. It was aimed to counter the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And so, Nazi infiltration into the United States government has been around for a long, long time, and it's due to Allen Dulles primarily. He was a Nazi lover and a Jew hater. He was just a monster of a man, and yet he stood at the pinnacle of U.S. power for so long. He's behind the assassination of President Kennedy. And that's in David Talbert's book, and there's an interesting story about that.
We're gonna come to the Kennedy part. I want to focus more on the Dulles brothers and Allen in particular protecting Nazis from prosecution, death, imprisonment at the Nuremberg trials. You referred to him arranging for hundreds of them coming into the United States to work on, it was Verner von Braun, who was a Nazi, who was glorified as the head of the American Space Agency, NASA, getting us into space and to the moon and beyond. Operation Paperclip. Many people have heard about that, but you just explained that's exactly what it is and why it happened. And as you mentioned, many of these Nazis were placed in very high positions throughout the United States federal government and related agencies. The other thing about Dulles that I want to make clear to people, he is the one who created the CIA as we know it today, and he created the infrastructure of the CIA. I believe it was Harry Truman that was disappointed with many different intelligence agencies, and he wanted the CIA to report directly to him. Now, a good friend of mine, maybe yours as well, Ray McGovern, worked in the CIA for 27 or 28 years as an analyst. And Ray has told me repeatedly, and he's expressed this publicly many, many times, there was this other section of the CIA that were clandestine operatives that did not report to anybody. They were completely unsupervised by Congress or the president, where the analysts would report daily to the United States president. I don't know, maybe even until today or in recent times, certainly through the time of Reagan and Bush. Um, and and I want to talk about now about this infrastructure that Alan Douglas created. Um, it has outlived him. You wrote in your article because today that clandestine, rogue, unsupervised agency is basically running the United States government. Can you expand on that?
Well, sure. That's very, very true. And what Ray McGovern says is very, very true. I think I mentioned to you previously that Ray and I lived near each other when we were growing up, but I won't get into that now. Today there are different terms that are used for it. The national security state, the deep state, deep politics, and it is this. Well, it's a part of the CIA that does all the dirty work and does the propaganda and does the assassinations and puts special forces and CIA thugs in countries all over the world, such as Ukraine at the present time, and all over the world. And so it's there are analysts like Ray McGovern was, who would give the daily briefing to presidents, but then there's this other part, this and you can't really find out much about them because it's all secrets, it's all hush hush, and they do the coup d'états and they do the assassinations. They're behind the Kennedy assassination, the Kennedys with an S, assassinations, Robert Kennedy, as well as John Kennedy. They run the country basically, but they run it for not just for themselves to run it. They run it for the forces that Alan Dulles and his brother represented, Wall Street, the Wall Street banks, the big banks. And so all the crises that we face, the bailing out of big banks, the banking crisis, it's all interconnected. But the CIA are the henchmen for this, at least one half of the CIA, or maybe 2/3. It's hard to know. But Lisa Peace, who wrote a book on the assassination of Robert Kennedy, a very good book, said that, in the 1960s, the real story of the 1960s is the takeover of the country by the Central Intelligence Agency. And Ray McGovern, of course, he often promotes a book by Jim Douglas, JFK and the Unspeakable, which is about the assassination of the president. And I know that Ray is very high on that book, and he mentions it often, as I am. So we have different levels to the government. We have the puppet show, the circus. We have the Trumps, the Bidens, the Obamas. And there's another story right there, if anyone wanted to pursue it. What are Barack Obama's connections to the CIA? And they go back very far in his life to his mother, and they're connected to Indonesia. Again, I mentioned this book, JFK versus Alan Dulles, Battleground Indonesia. It's quite shocking when you really research it and you see all the interconnections. You could very easily become paranoid, but that might be more of the reality than not being paranoid. Maybe paranoia is really sanity these days. because these people are everywhere. They're throughout the media, and the recent stuff with the Nord Stream pipeline with Seymour Hersh and his article, and then the reactions to it are it's some of it is comical, like the responses to Hersh and about a yacht blowing up the pipeline. These people have cover stories all the time, but
Yeah,
it's not pretty.
I want to talk about a couple of things. Alan Douglas, and I want you to comment on this. His favorite tools for any opposition were first defamation. They would destroy people's reputation and character using the media, which they control. And the second tool that Alan Dulles was famous for and liked particularly were assassinations.
Yes.
Now you mentioned Barack Obama. That can be a whole topic for another story. But Barack Obama, when he was president, bragged that he liked killing. He had his Tuesday meeting, called it Killing Tuesday, and he had a killing list that he would go through and he would decide who the United States, the CIA, would kill, extrajudicial assassinations, even an American citizen. And the third tool that they use, part of that assassinations are coup d'etat, color revolutions, and then using the media. They have been at this since Alan Dulles. I mean, he's the mastermind behind this. He's got a bunch of disciples now that are carrying on the tradition. You mentioned James Angleton. There was Richard Helms, and this MK Ultra mind control project that more and more people are talking about today, but most people have no idea what it's about. Mind control, using this technique to program people who, for example, commit assassinations. Maybe JFK, maybe Robert F.K., maybe Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, but mind control projects. And they've been big in what they call cultural engineering, using the media and propaganda constant over and over again to engineer a culture. The United States has been subject to that for all of these years. So let's talk a little bit about the tools that they use and really why the CIA and that clandestine branch is so effective and terrified.
Well, they're terrified because a lot of people are throughout the world are starting to learn about their game and to see through it. But at the same time, their games go on every single day. Like you mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the people who knows a lot about the history of the CIA and who has written about it eloquently and comprehensively is Robert Kennedy Jr. And as you know, he's just announced that he is going to run for the Democratic nomination for president, just as his father did in 1968. And as soon as this became known, the hatchet jobs on Bobby Kennedy have started. And you can just look up anything in the U.S. press. I mean, I've seen 2 or 3 in the last 3 days, and they will try to trash him and trash him and trash him and trash him, and reduce him to some kind of nutcase. But he's not a nutcase. That's their problem. And he's eloquent, and he has guts, and he will fight back. But this is what they do, and the mainstream media is the CIA. There's no real distinction between the U.S. and it's not just the CIA, it's the NSA and all of the intelligence agencies, and they're vast and huge in numbers. But the CIA is a shorthand for them all, and they control the media totally, and they've been from the start doing cultural revolution as well. The CIA's involvement in the dissemination in the late 50s of Boris Pasternak's book, illegally disseminating it, translating it. I'm talking about Dr. Zhivago, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. But the CIA used Boris Pasternak. He was not a part of it, but they used him. And they infiltrated all the literary journals, the magazines. It was a planned cultural assault, and here's, I think, the most important thing. People know about. They've heard MK Ultra. Well, it's mind control, and it works in different ways, whether it's through electric shock therapy or the use of drugs or sensory deprivation. It's connected to McGill University in Montreal and other universities. But most people, even people on the left, have written about it as if it ended because they said, the CIA said it ended. Well, what kind of fool would you be to believe them? It never ended. I'm sure it doesn't have the same name, code name, but it's going on right to the present day. And all you have to do is listen to the American press, television, New York Times, Washington Post. It doesn't matter. All of them, Fox News. It makes no difference. They are all propagandists for the deep state. They're controlled. They're run by billionaires. And again, that takes us back, to who's Wall Street? Who are these banks? Who is the Federal Reserve? They're all interconnected. So you can't believe any of this crap that you read in the newspapers or see on television. You'd be a fool. Today I saw this stuff about Russia and Ukraine. It's just lies, simple, more lies every day. They just switch it from this way to that day by day. So I think people are waking up to it, but at the same time, people are being taken in by it still. Because, take National Public Radio. That's a good example. I mean, it's loved by liberal Americans. They love it. They think it's, the be all and end all of news reporting. And it's run by the U.S. propaganda chief, John Lansing. Well, is that just a coincidence? Well, of course it isn't. You'd have to be very naive. And you mentioned before our show, Doug Valentine. Doug Valentine, who's written about the CIA extensively, as part of organized crime, the CIA as organized crime. He's written that the mainstream media is the CIA. You can't distinguish the two. And I agree.
Yeah. You mentioned RFK Jr. He just announced his candidacy for the presidency, opposing Joe Biden. I can't believe Joe Biden is going to run again. So I don't know who else is going to get in this race. But, the thought I had when I read that Bobby Kennedy Jr. was going to run, I said, oh my God, another Kennedy fatality. They won't hesitate to do to him what they did to his uncle and his father. And yet, not only has he pissed them off because he's against everything that's happening from this, whatever you want to call it, the Democratic Party, the progressive, the liberal left, or whatever you want to call it, he's also in their sights because he's been campaigning against COVID-19. He's got a very vast, aggressive, prolific organization behind him, created a movie, a documentary. So he's got to have a target on him. I can't believe he doesn't. All right. Well, let's segue then. Well, before I go to the John F. Kennedy, that whole history, and that's amazing. That'll take some time. The other thing that I didn't know about, and you mentioned in your article, was Allen Dulles hated Stalin, the Soviet Union, and you mentioned something I didn't know of, Operation Splinter Factor. Can you explain for me now again and our audience what that was?
Well, that was a an operation of the CIA to make Stalin paranoid for sure, if he wasn't already. And so Allen Dulles, what's the right word? He was such a treacherous son of a bitch. There was a fellow who was I can't remember his name at the moment, but he was basically told this. The Soviet Union, Stalin was basically, he was presented as a kind of agent within this Soviet sphere of influence, and Stalin became so disturbed by it all. He had thousands and thousands of people that had anything to do with this guy assassinated, mostly in Germany, I believe. But Allen Dulles would, and this is in David Talbert's book, he would betray anyone. There's a quote in the Talbot book about how he considered people mice, and he just got great pleasure out of when he lulled them into the trap, and the trap fell on their necks and killed them. He just thought that was so wonderful, and he was behind the killing of tens of thousands of people. He betrayed anyone who was Jewish. He was such a Nazi lover. His wife, his mistress of long standing, they all thought he was a cold assassin, really. Not that he ever got his hands dirty in a literal sense, but he had other people do it for him, including the killing of President Kennedy's great ally, Dag Hammarskjöld. The list is very, very long. So he was right from the start of his career. He was anti-communist and anti-Russian and anti-Soviet right from the beginning. He was involved with the father of a guy named Mohrenschildt, who was involved with the Kennedy assassination in Baku, which is now Azerbaijan, with the Rockefeller oil interests. This goes back to like 1920, 25, and it was all part of intelligence and business dealings against Russia, against the Bolsheviks, and against the Soviet Union. A crazed anti-communist, Cold Warrior, and an evil man.
All right. I couldn't agree more. And when I finished reading Talbot's book, that's exactly what I thought. That Allen Dulles and his brother were evil personified. ruthless, cutthroat people, revengeful. And Talbot refers to him as satanic. I think all of those descriptions probably are pretty valid. I want to focus now on, you've mentioned JFK several times. It really made it clear in Talbot's book the involvement that Dulles had and others in the assassination of Kennedy. But I want to begin with the JFK speech when he was a senator in 1957. And he mentioned that Western imperialism had crushed people of the third world. And that was probably, I think, the first time that Kennedy drew the ire of people like Dulles and his cohorts. Let's pick it up from there, Ed. Tell me about that speech. Kennedy really became public enemy number one, especially after Kennedy fired Allen Dulles. So let's pick it up from 1957. We're going to go through the Bay of Pigs. Curtis LeMay was involved in terms of being the head of, I guess, the Defense Department or the Army, whatever it was. He was involved. And finally, ending with the assassination of Kennedy. Let's pick it up from 1957.
Well, in 1957, then Senator from Massachusetts, John Kennedy, gave a very, very dramatic speech in the U.S. Senate. And essentially what he said was that colonialism around the world has to stop. He spoke in support of the colonial countries and their need for independence, with a special emphasis, but not just on Africa. But he was talking about Indonesia, the countries in Asia, and so forth, the countries throughout the world. And this speech drew the ire of course, the Republicans, but interestingly, it drew the ire of his Democratic allies, who said, how dare he say this stuff, which proved right off the bat that the Democrats and the Republicans are really one party. They're the war party and they're the colonialist party. But JFK, he would have none of it. And he gave that speech, which kind of foreshadowed what he would do in the years to come, and would foreshadow his death, because he was a marked man from that day on. And then when he was elected in 1960, it wasn't long before the Allen Dulles and his cohorts made sure that Kennedy was undermined at the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961. I mean, he had only been president 3 months. And then Dulles, brought Kennedy into this trap. And Kennedy said he wasn't going to provide military or air power to this so-called band of invaders, ex-Cubans and CIA people. And of course, the CIA, the invasion was a disaster. And here's something very, very interesting. It shows how evil he was. The CIA found out, and many people don't know this, they found out before the Bay of Pigs that the Russians or the Soviet Union had intercepted messages, and they knew about the Bay of Pigs invasion in advance. And Allen Dulles knew this. And yet he urged Kennedy to go forward with it, knowing in advance that it would be met by the Cubans. They knew so much about when it would occur, that it was going to occur. But Dulles never told the president of the United States, because he was trapping him right then and there, which is what he did. But Kennedy realized, oh, these guys are evil. The CIA and Dulles. And that is why he fired Dulles later in the year, after the Bay of Pigs disaster. And he fired his top assistant, Dulles' top assistant, whose name was, what the heck's his name? I forget the guy's name at the moment. But Dulles' top assistant, his brother was the mayor of Dallas, Texas, on the day that President Kennedy was assassinated.
I want to stay on that period of the Bay of Pigs, when Kennedy realized he was surrounded by a pack of wolves who wanted to do him in. He and his brothers, Bobby and Teddy, came to realize this, that they were in this all alone, and they were in trouble. Not only did Kennedy fire Allen Dulles, but he fired Curtis LeMay. LeMay was a very powerful person. Curtis bombed them back to the Stone Age LeMay. He was the one behind the bombing of Dresden and other cities in Germany. He was behind the firebombing and the nuclear bombing of Japan. He too was an assassin, a killer, a murderer. Imagine this. If you kill enough of them, they quit fighting. This has been America's MO, I think, ever since, run by the CIA and the United States military. But I don't want to divert to that. There were some other factors that Kennedy was doing because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy, in back-channel communications with the then Premier Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, avoided a nuclear war. This was another reason why Kennedy had to be done away with. On top of that, they certainly knew that Kennedy had back-channel communications with Castro, looking for some kind of a solution with Castro. And then it was also what he wanted to do with the Federal Reserve. And then he wanted to get out of Vietnam. And so these were all things that Kennedy did and wanted to do that turned Allen Dulles, Curtis LeMay, even the military, these wealthy people that had invested a lot in American militarism around the world, that led up to Kennedy's assassination. Let's pick it up from there. And we'll pick it up with Kennedy's famous speech at American University, which was just a month or two, I forget how many months before he was assassinated in 1963. Pick it up from there, Ed.
Sure. It was on June 10th, 1963, when President Kennedy gave what has become his very dramatic or very famous, or it should be, American University commencement speech. And in that speech, he called for the abolition of nuclear weapons, for an end to the Cold War, to the end to war period, to disarmament, and so forth. And he didn't say it would be easy, but he said it would be necessary. Because if we do not do this, all life on this planet will end. There will be a nuclear war. And our children, and the children of Russia, and the children of every country in the world will have no future. And it is a must-view speech to listen to and or read. And it's readily available on the internet. But that speech, just was angered the right wingers and the CIA so much And subsequent to that, he signed a treaty with the Soviet Union. Yes, in 1962 in October, he and Khrushchev got together, and thank God they, avoided nuclear war. And he wanted to pull out of Vietnam, and he signed a document, NSA document, I think it's 262, saying we're going to pull all 1,000 troops out of Vietnam by the end of this year, and all the rest out within the next couple of years. And right after the president was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson changed that all almost immediately, a few days after the president was dead. And I think it was the morning of or the day after his burial, or over the weekend, it might have been, I forget. It was within a few days. But Johnson reversed it all. He reversed the entire thing. And so the Vietnam War then went on. And again, one of the craziest things here is we know Johnson just lied through his teeth. And then by early in 1968, he was the peace candidate, of course, in 64 against Barry Goldwater. And then in 68, Johnson, withdraws. He's not going to run for election. And then we have that whole sequence of events, the killing of Dr. King in April, the entering into the race of Eugene McCarthy for the Democrats, and then Bobby Kennedy. We have Bobby Kennedy killed, and of course, and then Nixon gets elected because he's the peace candidate. And Vietnam goes on till 1965, and it's a boondoggle for, it's a boom in terms of money for Bell Helicopter and the war manufacturers. But, so Americans died, who really gave a damn until late in the game. And millions of Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians were killed by this war machine. And so Kennedy had to go. By the fall of 1963, they decided we had to kill him. And what they did was they did it in public view. It wasn't like an assassin with a pistol would go into a room and shoot someone. No, we're going to do it right out in the open. We're going to blow his brains out, the back of his head, and everyone will ultimately get to see it, or at least the crowd will see it in Dallas. And we'll send a message to every future American president. Don't mess with us. If you do, you're dead. You'll have your head blown off too. And every single president since has known that and has obeyed. Every single one. Not one has been any different. They've all gone along with it. They're afraid of the CIA. And Ray McGovern said somewhere along the line, he said, I hate to admit it, but I think the presidents are afraid of the CIA. Well, he's right. They are. And so now we will have another election, but it's not going to make any difference. And that's why Bobby Kennedy Jr., who's in the race, is entering into this dangerous territory. They'll probably just try to destroy him by reputation. But if he gains ground and he actually becomes a threat to them next year, it becomes a much more dangerous situation. But he's a very courageous man. He's a very courageous man. And I have great admiration for him.
Yeah, I do too. I want to backtrack a little bit, get back to Kennedy's assassination. What role did Dulles have in the Warren Report?
Well, he made sure to, so the Warren Report, is, I think most of your viewers know, was the official report commissioned by Johnson into the assassination. And right from the start, Allen Dulles, who Kennedy had fired, and was head of the CIA, made sure that he got on the Warren Commission, and he basically controlled the Warren Commission and anything that had to do with the CIA and the Kennedy assassination. So the guy that Kennedy fires investigates his assassination, his murder. And again, I think it's important to say there are people who are still out there, debating whether the CIA killed Kennedy. And that's all disinformation. It's a lot of nonsense. It's a pseudo debate that diverts from the fact that it's very, very evident, very, very obvious. And it was from the beginning, but is so clear now that the intelligence agencies killed the president, together with the military in some capacity. So let's just call it the national security state. But all this talk about if the files that haven't been released yet, and Biden and Trump, and it's meaningless. It's meaningless. It's just continuing. It's like saying, let's continue debate 9/11, or let's continue debate, Bobby Kennedy's assassination or MLK. We know what happened. It's not speculation. There's overwhelming evidence. There's overwhelming evidence that these people were killed by U.S. government forces. But some people want to debate it forever. And that's just a game.
Yeah. And, I think one of the things about the JFK assassination, you mentioned it, they orchestrated this in public view. There's nobody who was alive at that time that did not see Walter Cronkite cover this and did not see the replays of the killing. There's a Bruta film. They have not seen the replays of the hospital where they brought Kennedy to. Jackie Kennedy taking something back to Washington, and there's evidence that says that JFK was not in that. He was in the plane. I mean, this is incredible. Do you think that this JFK assassination, being a public event, it really was, do you think that that is connected in any way with 9/11? As they called it, the neocons, the Project for the New American Century. We need another Pearl Harbor. Both of these events, Kennedy's assassination and 9/11, were traumatic events to the American psyche. Would you agree with that?
Completely agree, of course. They're the two foundational events of the last 60 or 70 years. And they are the two events that certain members of the U.S. left will not discuss, will not broach, discuss, and so on and so forth. Most notably, Noam Chomsky, who is the saint of the American left. He doesn't think the Kennedy assassination was very important, whether who killed him and so forth. And 9/11 is not worth, but Chomsky has a lot of followers, and they won't go there either. They won't go there either because these events are definitely linked. It's not that necessarily the same people were involved, but the same structure of the deep state, the same structure of the national security state was involved in both events. And now they're all involved in, they were involved in Russiagate. They're involved in the U.S. A war against Russia. They're up to their eyeballs in this. Now, Chomsky will write about and speak about the war in Ukraine, and to his credit. But there are others who follow him when it comes to these assassinations. And they really don't know much, or they play dumb. I don't know which it is. They don't know much. And actually, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the evidence in that case is just like ridiculously huge and clear. But no one, very few people know anything about it. And, this is again June 6th, 1968. And, he was he was running on an anti-war platform, of course. He was going to then look into his brother's assassination. They couldn't have this. They couldn't allow it.
I'm one of the people, and I think there are others that believe Noam Chomsky is controlled opposition. His different positions are incompatible. Doesn't want to investigate Kennedy assassination, leave it in the past, forget it. Doesn't want to investigate 9/11. It's not worth it. And yet, on the other side, he's the poster boy and the love child of the left, the Democrats, the progressive left. It's really incredible. You mentioned that since the Kennedy assassination, another aspect of that is that was a very clear message to every succeeding president that if you go against us, you're going to have the same fate. You mentioned that earlier. And then you mentioned Trump. I followed Trump's overtures to Putin and Russia. And I downloaded their summit at Helsinki and the speech that they gave afterwards, press conference. It was all lovey-dovey. Trump, this is what we're going to do. We need to establish communications. We need to be back in touch in diplomacy, not confrontation. And it was an amazing speech. And I think Trump was sincere. He didn't even get back on that plane to leave Helsinki when the likes of Lindsey Graham, John McCain, and others, including the mainstream media, trashed him so bad, calling him Putin's puppet, a Kremlin asset. The pictures distorted of the two of them on Time magazine and newspapers across the country. And then all of a sudden, Trump changed. He became anti-Russian. He was involved in doing away with, I forget which treaties, but some of the treaties, nuclear arms treaties. And I said at the time, you know what? When he gets home, he's going to get a visit. The next morning in the Oval Office with these figures, they're going to show him a silver bullet with his name on it. And I believe that Trump was threatened by these actors and his family was threatened, and he switched his position on Russia. Absolutely the opposite, turned around. This has been fascinating. I want to finish on this note. You have something in your article about what Charles de Gaulle said. Talk about that before we conclude the program.
Sure. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, was the CIA attempted to assassinate him on numerous occasions, and he was able to, his people were able to foil the assassination attempts on de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle knew that Kennedy was killed by his own intelligence people. He said, this is what these people do. And they tried to do it to me and they didn't succeed, but they did get the president of the United States. And he knew it. I think many people knew it right from the start, but they didn't want to say it. It was too much of a hot potato at the time. Fidel Castro knew it, And he made it very, very clear that he wasn't, that Kennedy was killed by U.S. forces, not by him for sure. And as you mentioned, when the day Kennedy was shot, a French journalist, his last name was Daniel, was in Havana talking to Fidel Castro. And he had stopped by the White House, and Kennedy wanted him to be an intermediary with Fidel Castro. So some of these leaders, they knew right away that this was fake. And the whole story of Oswald, that's a whole other issue that we could spend days and days talking about. But Allen Dulles was connected to George de Mohrenschildt, who was Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA handler in Dallas when this so-called U.S. Marine defector came back to the country with a loan from the U.S. State Department and went to Dallas to live, and the whole game started there. But Allen Dulles was in 1920s was connected to de Mohrenschildt's father in Baku for Rockefeller Oil and this, the U.S. intelligence, and this was all against the Soviet Union. So now you have this guy Mohrenschildt, who is Russian, right? That's where his family's from, but he's in Dallas, and he's a CIA asset. And then de Mohrenschildt supposedly kills himself in Florida years later, before he's being called to testify before the U.S. Congress. You just can't make it up. You cannot make it up.
Yeah, Ed, I want to thank you so much. This has been really very enlightening. And before we go, I want to mention your book again, Seeking Truth in a Country of Lies. It's available on Amazon. I encourage viewers to get a copy of this book. I also want to strongly recommend, if they haven't read it, you must. David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government. This is a spellbinding book, a very frightening book, a very alarming book. And the other book that I want to recommend, and I couldn't put this one down either, was Jim Douglas's book on JFK and the Unspeakable. These are three books that are incredibly relevant today and helpful in opening the eyes of Americans, but not just Americans, as other people around the world who have bought in to the CIA lies and propaganda for 78 years, at least as long as I've been alive. So, Ed, thanks so much. We'll look forward to having you back again.
Thank you, Regis. Always good to be here. Happy Easter.
Thank you. The same to you. We'll see you soon.
Okay, bye.